From the News Channel 5 Network, this is MorningLine with Nick Barris.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us on Morning Line. Nick Barris coming to you live and direct from Studio A on this Wednesday morning. We're coming to you on the Plus as well as streaming live on Facebook at News Channel 5. If you'd like to join us there as well, you can call into the show. We'll get the phone lines up, and we also will take any comments or questions you bring to me. I've got the computer here in front of you to monitor anything that's asked on Facebook. So join us on that. This morning, it's going to be a show of a political bent as we're less than 2 months away from the big presidential election. We are going to look at one aspect of the thing that's going to decide the outcome of this election, and that is going to be voter turnout. And some of the core groups, we understand there are those out there that in a certain group are expected to turn out and will always vote. And there are others, depends on maybe what's on the ballot, who's running. We all know that there is a much higher turnout during presidential elections, of course. And we also know that the candidates out there, especially both President Trump and, challenger Joe Biden, are doing what they can to cater to various groups here. And I'm specifically talking about certain minority groups, the African Americans, the Hispanics, those core groups, how they'll turn out and vote and what drives them historically. We're going to get into all of that. And I wouldn't mind hearing from you about your thoughts on what you're going to do in terms of voting. But to talk more about some of these trends and what we're looking at coming up this election is Dr. Brian Russell. He's a political science professor from over at Tennessee State. Good morning to you, sir. Thank you for joining us.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
You're coming to us from, you said, your office pod at home where you're teaching your courses right now on social distancing, right, at TSU?
That's right. This is where I'm teaching my classes from this semester, and I got an American flag back up because I teach American government classes, and so this is kind of where I'm teaching from this semester.
Wow, that's awesome. Listen, well, thank you for joining us this morning, and just let's start kind of broad based on this, and you can give me some of your observations, historically speaking, with regard to, I guess, the minority vote that can cover a lot of ground there, and the turnout, and what's expected and what isn't expected, as we look historically, maybe the last few presidential elections leading up to this. What are your thoughts on that, and what turnout sometimes can be expected to be?
Okay, so when we're thinking about turnout, and especially in the 2000s, presidential elections have been trending upward since the 2000s. And like you said at the beginning of the show, during elections, presidential elections, that's when a whole bunch more people turn out to vote. It is going to be in midterm elections where we tend to have lower turnout rates. And so presidential election years, everybody's focusing on it, right? It grabs the attention of the media. And then so it's a highly salient race. And then so people tend to vote more frequently during presidential elections than they do in midterm elections. And basically since the 2000 elections have been competitive and contested, and there's been, in 1996, we kind of saw a dip in presidential voting, and that was kind of a low point. But since that point, it has been going up as these elections have been competitive. And when we're talking about minority votes, historically, African Americans have slightly lower participation rates than whites, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that, I think, in the show historically. But basically, since 2000, those participation rates between African American whites have narrowed a lot. We know that in 2008, the participation rates between African American and whites was essentially identical. And then in 2012, African Americans actually had a higher participation rate than whites in 2012, and then there was a drop off in 2016. Hispanic Americans don't tend to have as high voting rates as African Americans and whites, but those have been trending up since the 2000s also.
So can you talk a little bit then about the core group? What is the core group in terms of our electorate that is almost always counted on to vote historically? What is there a demographic that you can point to that you say, yeah, we know for sure these people are going to vote regardless always, and then some of these others, maybe it'll depend on what's happening that particular year or the candidates involved?
Okay, so when we're talking about voting, the things that we know that affect and influence voting, older Americans tend to vote more.
Okay.
More educated Americans tend to vote more. More affluent Americans tend to vote more. And so demographically, when we look at our population, that helps us understand participation rates. The highest participation rates are going to tend to be Caucasians, right? They tend to be an older population. They tend to be a more affluent population. They tend to be a more educated population. When we're looking at groups, African Americans are going to have the next highest participation rates. And in fact, when you control for things like education and income level, African Americans actually have higher rates of participation. So the two highest groups in our society with regular participation rates are going to be white Americans and African Americans. Hispanic Americans and Asian Americans tend to vote in lower rates. And so, over the last 20 years in presidential races, we're talking, the average amount of white votes are going to be, 60 to 65% of the population. African Americans are going to be just below that, 55%. Hispanics and Asians tend to be below 50% people voting in elections. But election after election, we count on people who are older, people who are more educated, people who are more affluent, people who are more connected to their communities. These are the type of people that turn out and vote regularly. When we're looking at coalitions and we're trying to understand the vote, when we're talking about these core groups of making coalitions, minority voters are a core part of the Democratic coalition, especially African-American voters. African-American voters, while not representing a large group of Americans, represent a group of Americans that consistently vote and tend to vote Democratic. And so that's an important part of their constituency. Some of the things that we're looking at this election cycle is going to be people who can, candidates that can reach out to the Hispanic community. And we see a little bit of data right now suggesting that maybe some Hispanics are maybe going towards the Republicans, going towards Trump more than they traditionally did or in the last election. And that's something that the Democrats are scrambling for right now. All
right. Can you give me, with regard first, and we'll touch on some of these various groups, with regard to African Americans, what was turnout in the last presidential election among African American voters compared to the turnout during the two prior presidential elections when you had the re-election of President Obama and, of course, initially his election? Were the numbers down a bit from the last two presidential elections to the one that led to the election of President Trump?
They were. And when you look at numbers, we can look at percentage of people voting, percentage of eligible people voting, percentage of people reporting. And I have some of the numbers from the census numbers talking about reporting for voting. And in 2016, participation rates among African Americans was down. Specifically, if we look at 2008 and 2012, in 2008 was the first time in an election history that the voting rates of whites and African Americans was essentially identical. We're talking about the 65% range. Hispanics were still going to be below 50% at that point. But in 2008, African Americans voted at really high numbers. 2012, African Americans voted at the highest rate of any group in our electorate. And in that election, President Obama received about 71% of the Hispanic vote. But in 2016, African American turnout decreased, and so we're talking about from 66% to down to 59%. And that's a drop of 6 or 7 points, and that's an important part of the Democratic coalition. And so when we're looking at 2016, there were a couple of key races, right? There were a couple of key races in 2016 that really made a difference. States like Pennsylvania, states like Michigan, and those are states that Democrats haven't lost since 1988. And I don't know the exact dynamics here, but African American vote was down nationwide. And I'm postulating here that decreased African American turnout in Philadelphia, around the Philadelphia suburbs, made a difference in that Pennsylvania election. Same thing in Detroit. And then so the Republicans won Pennsylvania and they won Michigan for the first time since 1988. And, that was the difference in the election. So black turnout really made a difference in that race. And And Hispanic turnout is going to make a difference this time, as well as black turnout. And we see the parties we see Trump making a reach, going into Florida, trying to reach out to the Hispanic community, because some data suggests that maybe President Trump and Republicans are going to pull a larger percentage of Hispanic votes than they did in the last election.
It's going to be interesting because it's going to play a key role in who gets elected, these groups we're talking about. Listen, let's take a break. When we come back, more of our conversation with the professor. We've got some phone calls and comments to hit on, as well as we continue to discuss what we can expect for voter turnout this upcoming presidential election. We'll be right back with more right after this.